Hello everyone, this is Ben, and what we're going to do in this video is discuss some of the objections to the biblical book of Genesis that are raised, I guess, sort of scientifically. Like Genesis, people read it and they're like, I don't know, that they would say that science disproves Genesis and things like that. What we're not going to do is talk about chapter 1 because it's done to death. I've done it multiple times. And what I want to do in this video is just start with chapter 2 and go through as much as we can, hopefully all the way through really everything else that you would run into in the rest of the book, for the most part. And just take a look at this, and we're just going to start in chapter 2, not at the very beginning of chapter 2, but like verse 4, because the real break is verse 4. And, we're, just everything, from like Noah's flood to like, did God, the whole world was covered with water, or like, why would, and also a question, it's not really a science question, but people often raise is like, why would God kill everyone like that? Other questions like, Adam and Eve, did they really exist, and are all humans descended from them? And did humanity originate on this planet 6,000 years ago? Because that's in what we're going to be looking at. Just a bunch of things. So for the framework, for sort of the outline, I think the best way to do this, because if I start doing this and I try to do it topically, I start jumping all over the place. And so to keep me grounded in how I talk about this, I'm going to use the Bible itself as the outline. So we're just going to start in Genesis 2:4, and we're just kind of gonna go. So what I'm not going to do is jump around. Okay, so that's going to help keep me, grounded, I guess. So we'll take a look at the flood. We'll take a look at the Tower of Babel. We're going to take a look at Genesis 6 and this whole apparently supernatural beings come down and like mate with human women and produce demigod offspring. That's an interesting one because even people who believe in a global flood don't think that really happened. Like no one will. let's have a look at that before we even get into this. Answers in Genesis, they're usually let's see what they have to say about that. I'm curious before we get into this. Yep, they take it as there's no supernatural beings there. Okay. Hold on, let's double check. Because some people interpret that and they say it's just humans. So I just thought of this right now. Hold on. Hold on, let's find out what the AIG view is. I'm so curious. My curiosity is off the charts because Answer to Genesis, they believe that like humans and dinosaurs coexisted, and there was a global flood that explains most of Earth's geography. And so I'm curious, like, did they think that like gods basically fell away and came down and mated with human women? Is that how they interpret it? But Genesis 6 and that whole story, that's one of the all right. Okay, so they take the view that okay, hold on. Oh my goodness. They really take this seriously. They struggle with this. This article is so long. Oh, this article is so long. Okay, so they take that it's just all humans and that there was no supernatural. So, I mean, that's the point I'm trying to make is that you know, it's hard to find anybody who thinks that like Genesis 6 that they don't because in other words, scientists would object and say there's no evidence for supernatural beings. These are supernatural beings coming down from the God realm and mating with human women and producing demigod offspring. It's like Hercules or Gilgamesh was a demigod, and that sort of thing. So, like, even Answers in Genesis has their limits, I guess. They're because I hate to say it, but like, it does feel like a lot of people reject the supernatural nature of that particular story because of how do I put it? Because people have a hard time in a modern scientific worldview accepting the existence of gods and supernatural beings that mate with human women and produce half divine offspring who are giants, and that sort of thing. And then we've got the Tower of Babel story, really important. We have to talk about that, so we're gonna have to get to that, and then the relationship between Tower of Babel and basically everything that comes before Abraham and post Abraham. So maybe that kind of sets up, where we're going with this, so that you'll have some sort of idea where we're going with this. So, let's just get right to it. Genesis 2:4 says I'm not going to read everything in the whole book of Genesis, but we will read what it seems like it's necessary. So anyway, Genesis 2:4 says, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens." Remember, any issue you're going to raise about chapter 1, about the age of the earth, about flat earth theory models, and about like the order of events, the sun being created after plants, all that stuff, like, that's not going to be part of this particular video, because there's we can talk about that for an hour or two, and whenever you talk about the other stuff. Okay, so it says, "When no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up." Okay, all right. So already we've got an issue that we need to address in the second verse that we're talking about. And it says, "When no bush of the field was yet in the land." All right. So here's one of the first problems that's going to keep coming up for us. Is that, generally speaking, the Jewish language, the ancient Hebrew language that we're reading, having been translated into English, generally speaking, it has way less words than English. So, like, there are words that are the one word, it's the same word every time in the original language, but in our language it's translated different ways. So when it says, "When no bush of the field was yet in the land," okay, the problem is that word "land" is a word that's hopefully by the end of this video is going to be very familiar to us if you follow along with this video. It's this Hebrew word. If I pronounce it right, it's eretz. Okay? Alright, so eretz with an H after the E. Eretz. Okay. Anyway, it's translated as land 1,543 times in the King James. It's translated as earth 712 times. So it can mean like just a land or like a region, but it can also mean like the planet, or like all of the land. The literal earth, or like a section of the earth. It's the same word both times, and you have to look at how it's used in the situation it's used in, which is called context, to figure out how to translate it. And sometimes it's like, choose your translation. It can also mean the underworld, like the abode of the dead, like God, curses evil beings to have to go and live in the underworld, that sort of thing. So hopefully that lets you know how this video is going to go. Let's see. All right, so we've gotten that out of the way. That's important. That's going to be, important for later. All right, so, right here, there's no rain, and a mist was going up from the land, watering the whole face of the ground. It says, "Then the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. Okay, so there's a couple things we need to talk about at this point. The first thing is simple. In Genesis 2:7 it says, "Then the Lord God formed the man of the dust of the ground." So the word Lord there is actually the Hebrew name for their God, who they consider to be the true God. In their view, the gods of the other nations exist, but no God is like their God, I guess. So they're monotheistic for sure. But it's not like they think the other gods are imaginary. So the name for their God is Yahweh, just like all these gods have names. Marduk, Ishtar, Inanna, Enki, Ea, Ra, Isis and Osiris, Horus, Baal, El, Zeus, Athena, like all of those, they all have names. So the God of the Hebrews is named Yahweh. So every time it says capital Lord in your Bible, it's actually, that's how they translate Yahweh. So what I'm going to do, this can get confusing if I just use the word God all the time. Because in this we're going to see that Genesis actually refers to other gods. So for example, when it says, "Then the Lord God," all right, it's actually Lord is Yahweh. So it's and Yahweh, then so it's more like, this is really, then the Yahweh Elohim. Yahweh Elohim. So Elohim is a word that best translates into English as God. It can mean gods plural, or it can mean gods singular. It's like the word quail, or the word deer, or the word sheep in English. The plural is spelled the same as the singular. Okay, so it says, "Then the Yahweh Elohim formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature." Okay, so Yahweh is it means I am. And the possibility of the depth of the philosophical implications of a God having a name like that are immense, and we can't even start talking about it. Okay, we just can't go there. Just think about that, in your own time. Okay, now Elohim is a generic term for a god in this language that this is translated from. So what kind of term is it? Because the English word God actually comes from our old Anglo-Saxon ancestors, and it's a reference to like Thor and Odin, and all that. We've turned it into a Christian word, but it's when you read that in your Bible in the Old Testament, it's a translation of Elohim. So Elohim is a word, as I said, it can be gods or God. It depends on the context. And it does not describe what the being is. It is a description of where the being lives, or it's a residence term. So it's like, my name is Ben Joyner, and I am Ben Joyner the American. And American doesn't describe, how tall I am, what I look like, how I talk, or anything that I do, or anything that any of my personal properties. It really describes like where I live and where I reside and where I'm from. So an Elohim, that's a locational description. It means like a heaven being, a being that lives in the divine realm, in the God realm. So the Yahweh of the God realm, you can think of it that way. So we've got that out of the way. Okay, there's one more here. I think more than one more. We've got a few things to talk about here. Two more, I guess. One's going to be simple, and then one's going to be kind of long, but really important. Okay, so it says so the Yahweh Elohim formed the man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. Okay, so literally it's the man became a nephesh, which means that, like, in their view of the ancient Hebrews, that means that a nefesh is a being that has a soul. So a more literal translation would be, and the man became a living soul. Okay, so that word nefesh, for example, that's translated living being or living creature here in the ESV, but the King James just translates it as soul 475 times, which is the definition of the word, and that's not really debated as far as I understand. Now the interesting thing is, back in Genesis 1, it describes God creating these great sea creatures, and it says living creatures with which the water teems. It's literally the nefesh which with the water teems. So there was a sense, and this just comes from the general knowledge of the culture of the time, that certain animals had souls in their view. Certain animals were referred to as nefeshes, just the way that the man here is. Typically the mammal life that breathed. Okay, so, but wait, there's more. Okay, Genesis 1 talks about this, and Genesis 2 goes into this. But basically, in the ancient world, in the context of the ancient world, when you built a temple, first of all, it was a garden. The temples usually were full of plants, and they actually would have animals in the garden and plants. And it would be a well-maintained garden. So the next verse, it says, and the Yahweh Elohim, right, planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. So, like, Eden is not the garden, it's a region of land, like Mesopotamia or something, and within Eden, there is a garden that Yahweh made. Okay? Now, a garden in the ancient culture of that world is a temple. You know, especially one that an Elohim planted would definitely be a temple. Okay, not only that, we're going to have to go back to the first chapter, and talk about this as we move on. But the most important thing in any temple would be the idol or the image of the god. Well, in Genesis, Yahweh is creating the temple for himself, and humans are the idol of him, or the image of him. So, like, the most important thing in the temple, and, like, they didn't believe, so in the ancient world, what they would do is when they got through building the temple, they would have a special ceremony where the god would come and inhabit the idol. So the god doesn't exist within the idol, but at the end, you open up its nose and its mouth, and then the god can enter the idol that way, and then you can now have dealings with the god. In the ancient cultures, outside of the Bible, typically the god would actually literally get hungry, be immortal, but like still get hungry, and then the humans would provide food for the god, and then in return the god would do things for the human. But to have access to the god, you had to have the temple so that the god could inhabit the idol. And if the god wasn't happy with the temple or something, the god would leave. But you had to have that, and the god would enter into the idol. And if the idol was destroyed, the god wouldn't be destroyed, but you wouldn't have access to the god anymore. So it would be really important. And the temple was not a place of worship like a church. It was a place where the people whose job it was to do things for the god, it was more like literally the house where the god lives in their mind. Okay, so it becomes clear as we move through this that, like, Adam is not, he's not, he's got some kind of important role beyond just being a human that God created. He's created to do important things, to be the image of the God. We'll get into that more as we move on. But what we need, before we get into that, what we need to talk about is, all right, so this is the story right here that we're reading. The Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. The Lord God planted a garden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. This is the ESV. Okay. So, there's three basically views of this right here. One view would be that it's all a big metaphor, and it's not to be taken literally. It's just it's a metaphor. Another view would be that it's not a metaphor. It actually happened. God really did create this man, Adam. And I guess I should point out, a thing that is difficult to translate into English is the Hebrew word for man and their word for mankind and the name Adam are all the same thing. So, like, it's a little bit confusing. So this is Adam, whose name means man. So it's like God created man and named him man. You know, it's like naming your dog dog and your cat cat. So anyway, and you name your man man. So, all right. So like I said, the one view of this creation of man story here in Genesis 2 is that it's just a big metaphor. And it all has all kinds of symbolic meanings. Another view is that it actually happened, but there were other humans that already existed. And then another view is that this is the creation of the first ever human. So Adam is the first human. Okay, and so, or you can think of it. We'll put it this way: you've got the metaphorical view. You've got the pre-Adamic view, which means there's humans before Adam. And then you've got the what I'll call the original pair view, where Adam and then later Eve, she comes into the chapter a little later, are the first two humans. Okay, so those are the sort of the three ways to take it. Now, first thing I want to talk about is the metaphorical view. I think the metaphorical view of this particular part of Genesis is wrong. I think that what Genesis the way the writers intended us to take this, is that this actually happened. Okay. That still leaves the pre-Adamic view on the table and the original pair view on the table. And I think when it comes to those two, Genesis basically, it doesn't teach one or the other, it allows for either. And we're going to take a look at that in just a minute, but first we need to deal with this metaphorical view. So, first of all, we have to ask ourselves, all right, is it even plausible? Is God, at least, in the view of Genesis, does God at least sometimes speak metaphorically? The short answer is absolutely. God absolutely speaks metaphorically, uses metaphorical language. Specifically, at the end of Genesis, metaphorical language is thick. Like, you have Joseph. So, for example, Joseph has two different dreams that are metaphorical in their interpretation. Then you have Pharaoh. He's in the prison. And you have Pharaoh's wine bearer and Pharaoh's baker, and then Pharaoh himself. These are all dreams from God where God is speaking to the people using a lot of metaphor. So, for example, the baker has a dream that he has, like, I think 7 bowls of bread or flour or something on his head, and then birds come and eat the flour. And he asked Joseph to interpret it, and Joseph said, this is what God's telling you, or this is what Yahweh's telling you, that in 7 days you will be hung to death. You'll be executed, and birds will come and eat you. So, obviously God spoke through metaphor, or Yahweh spoke through metaphor. Let's try to keep that clear here. So, it's certainly plausible that, Yahweh would speak through metaphor. So then the question becomes like, okay, well, how do you tell when? Well, all right, here's the thing. You have to assume the language is literal until you have some sort of reason to take it metaphorically. So the default assumption must always be literal language. And I'll explain why that is. if the default, so for example, here's a metaphor. You could say, let's say that a football team beat another one, 50-0. You would say, all right, they beat them 50-0. You'd say they murdered them, or they killed them, or they destroyed them. Those are all metaphorical usage of the language. Those are not to be taken literally. So, or here's another example. In Genesis 2, Eve is created, and then it says this: therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Well, that's obviously a metaphor, because we know that that's not how, husbands and wives don't literally become one. They don't get sewed together and become Siamese twins or something, or do some kind of, they're still separate, physically separate, but there's a lot of metaphorical meaning to that. It's rich metaphorically, but literally it's not true, so it's sort of obvious. So, anyway, let's go back to that example I was just telling you about with the football. And we'll just focus on the word murder. Okay, if everyone used the word murder as a way of saying that you won a game, some sort of game, by a large amount of points, by a huge point spread, and they always used the word murder to refer to that, and if no one ever used the word murder to refer to killing a person literally in terms of homicide, then if that goes on long enough, then that's how languages change. And so that's how the literal meaning of the word murder changes to just mean beating someone by a lot of points. Okay, so the literal meaning of the word has to be the default assumption. If you assume metaphorical, then you've just changed the literal meaning of the word. You've just changed the definition of the word. Okay, so it's not metaphorical anymore if it's assumed from the outset. If it's assumed from the outset, that is what a literal meaning is. That is the very essence of what makes a meaning literal. So if you use the word murder to just if everyone in the culture for for 100 years just always uses the word murder to refer to beating someone by a lot of points, then that becomes the literal meaning of the word. So that's my point. Okay, you have to assume literal until you have a reason to go metaphorical. Well, what Genesis does, and what the Bible often does, is give you a way to know. So for example, with this story in Genesis of the creation of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden, you have to assume it's literal until you have some sort of reason, some sort of justification for taking it metaphorically. Okay, well, the problem is, I don't see that. I can't find anything like that here. There's other stuff in there where I can find that. So, one of the things the Bible does to make it clear to you that it's using metaphors is it will contradict itself very blatantly and very intentionally. So that's a clear indication that okay, we should be taking this metaphorically. It's not meant to be taken literally, because it'll just blatantly contradict what it said. It's not like oh, they just they made a mistake when they wrote this. It's like, no, there's no way they missed this. This is on purpose. They did this on purpose. Another way is with Joseph. Joseph literally interprets the dream for you. And so it's just obviously that he's interpreting it metaphorically. And another way is with this, man and woman becoming one flesh. It's something that's just common knowledge that it doesn't happen. So there's some stuff in the Bible, that we would take metaphorically that people back then wouldn't. In your heart or something like that. They back in the day they thought you literally use your heart to think. But anyway, I don't see anything like that here in Genesis 2. There's no blatant contradiction like that. I'm not going to give you an example of what I'm talking about because we're going to get to one as we move through this. So when we get to Genesis chapter 5, we do have some. Two, actually. Okay, so anyway, there's that. All right, now, so again, what I want to, let's just make it clear, what I want to avoid doing is, it's real easy for Christians to come in and interpret Genesis, and whenever science contradicts Genesis, they can just say, oh, well, that's a metaphor. That thing that contradicts science, that's a metaphor. But see, sometimes science changes, and we're coming right up on an example of that. Sometimes science changes, and we discover that, oh, actually the Bible was correct about this particular thing. And then it's like, then Christians want to, have their cake and eat it too, and all of a sudden say, oh, well, we were right all along. Genesis was right all along. It was right all along. It's like, well, come on, guys. Like, if you, whenever the Bible contradicts science, you just say the Bible is being metaphorical here. And then when it agrees with science, all of a sudden it's not metaphorical anymore. And now look at you, you want a little feather in your hat. Okay. So we can't do that. Genesis, no. I don't see any good, reason as far as the Bible text is concerned, biblical text is concerned, for taking this metaphorically. Okay. And again, another big issue that, like, a lot of scholars agree with me that Adam and Eve actually existed. And another big issue that they always bring up is, like, you've got Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus's genealogy is traced through, Jesus existed, and you have all these people who actually existed, and it just traces right back to Adam. So that wouldn't make sense if Adam just didn't exist and was just purely a fictional, metaphorical character, So, like, it wouldn't make sense if Adam was just like a fable, and, in other words, like, if this story is metaphorical, then there was no Adam at all, and there was no, person named Adam, and, that God created. And it's just a story with, like, a lesson. Adam would be like Popeye or Luke Skywalker or Puff the Magic Dragon. You learn, or Alice from Alice in Wonderland. You learn a great lesson from the story, but that person didn't actually exist. That I don't see a good reason to take this particular thing that way. So anyway, there we go. Now let's talk about how science has shifted. And I think going back to 1996 was when the first ground was broken on this discovery. It's a fairly well-known discovery. What Genesis does is it describes a land of Eden, and it gives some actual geological description. So I'll just read it for you. It says, a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided and became 4 rivers. The name of the first is the Pishon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. Okay, and the gold of that land is good, bdellium and onyx stone are there. The second river is the Gihon. It is the one that flowed around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. Okay, so here's the issue. The Tigris and the Euphrates are well-known rivers that early civilizations have lived on for, going as far back as there has been civilizations. The earliest human civilizations go to the Tigris and Euphrates. But this Gihon and Pishon, like, as far as we know, there are no other rivers that, like, meet up with the Tigris and Euphrates. They're just 2 rivers that flow into the Persian Gulf. And there's no other rivers. So what are they talking about here? Well, what we discovered is that before 11,500 years ago, so 11,500 years ago, the Earth warmed up a lot. Alright? There was a major change in Earth's climate. Before that, it was much colder. And because it was colder, there was more ice on the earth. There was more ice on mountains. Mountains that weren't as tall still had ice on them. It was a colder earth. There was more polar ice. It was an ice age. And because more water is on land in the form of thick sheets of ice, then the ocean level is lower. And so the sea level is lower. And because the sea level is lower, then you have, first of all, dry land that today is not dry. And second of all, you have rivers where you wouldn't have had rivers, because mountaintops, specifically in Arabia and around the Tigris and Euphrates, there's all sorts of rivers that used to run because there was ice on the top of mountains back then, and the ice would melt as it moved down the mountain. It would slowly slide down the mountain, snow on top of the mountain, and the ice would slide down the mountain, and then you'd have a river. So there's actually a lot of rivers that used to exist around the Tigris and Euphrates. And the Persian Gulf was mostly dry. The amount that is now underwater was basically the size of Great Britain. And it was a freshwater lake system crisscrossed with like all sorts of rivers. There were underwater springs that came up that are still there today. It essentially would have been like the greatest oasis the world has ever seen, because remember, they're the Arabian desert, and right over in Persia is not exactly, not a jungle paradise either. So in the middle of this desert, you would have had this area with all these lakes, and there's all kinds of streams and rivers going all through it, and there's springs coming up from the ground, and the Tigris and Euphrates would have kept on flowing, and they would have met up with other rivers. There are multiple candidates for what could have been the Gihon and the Pishon. We don't know which ones. It depends on, it's hard to tell. But because of the progress of science, we now know that, like, not only do we go from having no rivers to having more rivers than we need, and we don't know which ones are the correct ones. Okay, so there's debate about where's the land of Havilah, where's the land of Cush. The problem is Cush means Ethiopia, but then it's like, well, the Hebrew language has no vowels, so that could be, it's all consonants. So Cush could be Kish, which would be Persia. So it's like, well, no, Also, let's just remind you that when it says the whole land there, like the whole land of Havilah, that's the whole Eretz. And so that creates a problem, when we get to the flood, it says like the whole earth was flooded. Does it mean the entire planet, or should it be translated the whole land? So anyway, we'll get to that. But bottom line, you can look this up. This is well known from science. You can just type in Persian Gulf Oasis. And today it is underwater. It's under the Persian Gulf. It was flooded. And we'll get to that as we move on. But anyway, so there's that. So, alright. We need to talk about the pre-Adamic view and the original pair view. Okay, but to do that, let's just move on to chapter 3, and we'll get to that view as we go. It'll come up for us. So we're going to let Genesis be our guide here. So Genesis 3 verse 1 says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God actually say, you shall not eat of any tree of the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden.'" Okay, so Eve is going to have a conversation with a serpent. It is the consensus of experts on this that it really should be translated serpent. There's a lot of reasons for that. Okay, but what's confusing about the serpent passage here is that for us, it's like, okay, the Bible is telling us that, like, snakes, the Bible thinks that snakes could talk. okay, back in those days, everyone knew that like animals couldn't talk. But in their culture, in the culture of the people this was written to, in other words, like, to understand what this text means, you have to understand who it was written to. It's not written to you. It's written to someone who lived basically 4,000 years ago. All right, and you know, in the ancient world, going way back, like it's written to those people by people back then. So the perspective on it should be, what did it mean to them? Because if you believe this is inspired by God, well, it's still inspired by God through that process. So in other words, yes, God oversaw that it was for you and for us today and for all people for all time. But it was not written to you. And in some examples, I mean, like the book of Romans or something like that, it literally says to the Christians at the city of Rome. It's not to you, it's to them. You know, but it's for you. So for you to understand what it means for you, you have to first understand what it meant to them directly. How would, in other words, the author was thinking about the person that he wrote it to, right? In how it was written. So here's the thing. In that ancient culture, supernatural beings were taken as a given. That was just how they saw the world. That was, you know. So they knew that snakes didn't talk, but they believed that gods transformed into other forms all the time. So in their view, as soon as the serpent talks, then it's clear that it's not a regular snake. That, in other words, in their view, they would be like, oh, okay, it's not a regular snake. So, like, for example, it's just something that, you know, would be normal in the ancient mythology of the ancient world that, like, we don't know about anymore. But, like, the gods transformed into all sorts of things. They would turn invisible. So, like, so for example, Athena would turn into an owl, and you know, they called her Athena Bright Eyes. That was her name. That was her other name, Bright Eyes. They would call her Bright Eyes, and she would be an owl, and she was always taking in information, you know, flying around looking at people, you know, or like in the Iliad, which is, you know, from this period, you know, Iliad's probably written around 1250 BC. Aphrodite would turn invisible and go on the battlefield of the Trojan War and try to help the Trojans against the Greeks. And then Athena, like, gave one of the Greek heroes some magic ability to see the invisible Athena so that he could throw a spear at her and hurt her. And then, I mean, at Aphrodite, and then Aphrodite would run away. And then she could heal because she was immortal, but she was upset and crying in her daddy's lap. Literally, she cried in her daddy's lap. And then asked her daddy to do something about it, you know. So anyway, that's just some examples. In the Odyssey, Athena often turns into an old man, you know, and then later she uses her magic to turn Odysseus into an old man, and the evil people who are trying to take over his kingdom that he's come to stop, they try to beat him up and hurt him, and they think he's just an old man, but then he's like stronger than he should be. And so, like, if you see, so for example, in that culture, like, as soon as they see the old man performing feats of strength and athleticism that he should not be able to perform, they know he's not an old man, you know. So here's another example from Egypt, in the story of how Horus became the ruler of the world. So Osiris is the ruler of the world, and his brother Set wants to rule the world, so he murders him and he cuts him up and he spreads the parts around the world. So Osiris's wife Isis teams up with Set's wife, and they go find the parts, and they use their magic to like bring him back to life by putting the parts back together. He impregnates Isis as he's floating above her and leaving to go to the underworld or the netherworld, or in the biblical term, Eretz, right? Land, earth, the earth, you know, the dirt. Okay. and then she gives birth to, so Set now rules the world because he murdered his brother, but Isis gives birth to Horus, the falcon god, who often has a falcon head. But they transform. I guess that's the important point you have to understand, and it's often an animal transformation. But like Horus wants to take over and rule, so he challenges Set to like a bunch of competitions, like games, like sports. And the final competition is they're going to have a boat race, and Horus says, "This is what we got to do. We're going to cut the top off a mountain, and then that's going to be your boat, and then we're going to race and see who's got the fastest boat." And so Set goes and cuts the top off a mountain and makes his boat out of that and puts it in the water and immediately sinks. And he's all mad. But Horus cheats and he makes a wood boat and covers it with plaster so it looks like and he's like winning. So then Set is really mad because he's getting dominated in this race. So he transforms into a hippopotamus and is going to murder Horus now in the race as a hippopotamus, because hippopotamuses are actually incredibly dangerous creatures. I think in Africa, like your chances, they're like one of the most dangerous animals you have to watch out for. They're like super dangerous. Don't go in the water with the hippopotamus, right? So anyway, that's just another example. I think how the story ends is Osiris goes to the other gods and he says, Set shouldn't really be in charge because he won the kingdom through murder, and all the other gods agree, and they put Horus in charge. And now Horus is in charge. Let's see. Let's see if we have any ones in Mesopotamia. I'm just going to use the internet here. Inanna. I'm just typing. She's one of the goddesses. Let's see. Inanna transforms. She's the ancient. She's real common. I'm betting. So she transforms men into women sometimes. She's the Mesopotamian sex goddess, the queen of heaven. I was thinking she probably transformed into something else to get people to sleep with her. Alright. She's associated with the planet Venus. Alright. Let's see. Oh, she was also a goddess of warfare. But I mean, with Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece, that's literally a triangle around ancient, yeah, I remember in the Epic of Gilgamesh, she sleeps with people and then decides she doesn't like them and kills them, so he refuses to sleep with her. So then she strategizes to kill his friend, Enkidu, and then Gilgamesh has to go through this like long cave. It's like years of walking through a dark cave to like find Utnapishtim, who is the guy who survived the flood, who now is immortal because the gods are like happy that he survived the flood, and then it's their version of the Noah flood. And then let's see. It's one of those things that's like so common. But I can't think of any, examples from Mesopotamia where the gods transformed. Let's try a different Mesopotamian god, Marduk. Marduk transforms. Now we've got like people doing magic. Okay, so I don't know. I guess we'll just take my word for it on this one. Now, I can't think of any examples, but from what I've seen of what they believed, I got one. I just remembered one. Gilgamesh goes to the. I can't believe I remembered this one. Gilgamesh goes and he finds Utnapishtim, and Utnapishtim tells him about this like magic flower you have to eat, and then you'll become immortal. And because Gilgamesh is real sad that like people die because his friend died, and he gets real sad. even though he's like killed multiple people. But this Enkidu was his friend, you know, and they had gone on many adventures killing monsters, and then so you know. But like Utnapishtim is like the Noah guy who like survived the flood with him and his wife were there, and he tells them all about the magic flower. And then like I think Gilgamesh has to get the flower, and it's like at the bottom of like this like lake or something. It's like a lake. He goes to the god realm, to the realm of the gods, like through this like long cave. He goes to the Elohim realm, and the language of the ancient Mesopotamians is similar to where the Old Testament Hebrew comes from. But what's more similar, and this is a big discovery, is the same alphabet and the same terminology and the same language pretty much was used at the Assyrian city of Ugarit. And we find many parallels through Ugaritic mythology and Mesopotamian mythology to the Bible. We're going to get to, you know, when I say parallels, I don't mean that the Bible copied them or they copied the Bible. Really what you have in the Bible is people who, it's like on Saturday Night Live. Right now, Donald Trump is still president. And on Saturday Night Live, Alec Baldwin is a professional actor who impersonates Donald Trump in order to make fun of him. So he pretends to be him, but it's in a way it's a skillful use of language and words and his skills as an actor to actually disagree. And so skillful use of words is what's called rhetoric. And you have, when you use a skillful use of words in a written text to put down something, that's called a polemic. And so what the Bible does is that it has a lot of polemicism, where it comes in and it takes this story from the Mesopotamians or the Ugaritic, and like often it's one of those two, and it has the Bible version of it, which flips the whole thing on its head and says you guys got it all wrong, you know. So there's a ton of that. We'll get to one of the example of that. I want more than one, but anyway. So like the back to Utnapishtim, right, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, I don't know, Gilgamesh gets the flower, he has to swim to the bottom of this like deep thing, and the flower grows in the bottom of the water, and like he finally gets it, and then it's like the immortality flower, and then a snake comes up out of the water and takes it away, and it's like lost, you know, because like he's only able to get like one petal or something. I forget how it works. But anyway, Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood, and he's all like, this is the story of the flood for them. And their story of the flood, it's super similar. There's multiple versions of in ancient Sumerian, Mesopotamian mythology stories that are super similar to Genesis 1 through 11. They have a very similar framework. The overall framework is like this. You have a creation event, some sort of creation event. They all have like a war. It's very well. I don't know if the old ones don't have the war. They don't have the war. The later stories have the war of the gods. The Greek stories have the war of the gods. But the earlier stories that go back to like 2000 BC, they don't have the war. They just have like creation event, and then there's like a long list of like people, like a genealogy list, like just like Genesis chapter 5, and they have super long ages of people. Like the people and before the flood lived like a super long time, or they reign on they're even longer. Like, so for example, in the Sumerian kings list, one of the kings reigns on the throne of this city for like 24,000 years, you know, so like super long. And then you have, then you have some sort of falling out between the gods and the people, and so a flood happens to kill a bunch of people. And then you have another list of like names to like cover like its time span, and then it brings you to like what would have been modern times, which is basically 2000 BC for all of these stories. And as you get closer to 2000 BC times, the ages of the people get less absurd. Like they just become like less absurdly long. Not 24,000 years, more like 60 years. This guy lived 60 years instead of. And there's 4 of them. There's the Atrahasis. I think Atrahasis is in there. It's similar. Sumerian Kings list. I don't know all of them. Let me get the book. While I'm getting the book, I'll tell you about Utnapishtim. So Utnapishtim is the Noah guy from Gilgamesh, and in the Gilgamesh story, they have the flood story in there, and the reason why the flood happens is because the gods had created the humans to make the food, and more importantly to do the farming. Because in that world they didn't have rain, they lived in the desert, but they had rivers, and farming was a matter of digging little irrigation ditches, and then you would flood your little field with like a little wood water blocker, dam, and you pull it up and let it flood it, and then you have a drain one on the downside, and so anyway, the let's see, how do I put it? The people live outside the temple, and they're partying all night, and they're wild and crazy, and they're drinking, they're getting drunk, and so one of the gods, Enki, is mad. Okay, here we go. Here's the story. So you got Genesis 1 through 11, Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, and the Sumerian Kings list. They all follow that same outline that I just explained. It is the same one that's in Genesis. I think they have the Babel story too. The Babel story is real common. It's like a lot of stuff's like all throughout. There's other elements of the Genesis story that are like all throughout all of these. But anyway, the god Enki is mad because people are partying all night, right? So then he decides to kill them all, and the god Ea is like smart. He comes to Utnapishtim and tells them to make the boat because he knows what's going to happen. He's like, you got to make the boat, And then he's like crafty about this, and Enki doesn't want that to happen. He wants to kill all the people. So then he uses his mighty god powers to make the storm. And it says like all the gods and goddesses are in their like flying thing they live in, and like they're all scared and like terrified. I don't remember if they're in their flying thing, but they're all scared and terrified of the flood, because it's such a terrible storm. That it's normal in the ancient culture, they would think that the gods lived in the sky. But anyway, but they would come down to the earth, and some of them lived in the underworld as like a punishment. They typically lived in the sky. But anyway, where were we? So Utnapishtim survives the flood, and then he has animals. It's just like Noah. Because when Noah gets off the ark, the first thing he does is he sacrifices. He makes a sacrifice to Yahweh. Well, Utnapishtim makes a sacrifice, but there's a huge difference. In the Bible, when Noah makes a sacrifice, God just smells it and is pleased, and he's more pleased with Noah's faith that he was willing to, sacrifice something to God. After he has nothing, after the flood has killed everything. That he's willing to, he's like it's like the widow's mite. He gave the last of what he had. That's a person who truly, loves God and follows God. That's the Genesis version. Okay, in the Gilgamesh version, it's different. So in the Gilgamesh version, the gods literally eat the sacrificed meat because they're hungry. And so after the flood, there's no people, and Utnapishtim is like the last guy, and so the gods are all starved and hungry. And so he makes the sacrifice, and they go bonkers, and they transform. Remember, the whole reason I brought this up. I think it's good for us to get the background as much as I can give you of this mythology. They transform into flies, and they come and land and eat they transform into flies because they're so hungry, and they buzz around the meat and eat it. Okay, so there you go. Hopefully that makes the point that in that culture, and I was trying to help get us into the mindset of that culture, when you have an animal that does something that animals don't do, then it's a god, because the gods transform all the time. Okay, So anyway, it's just a normal thing. So there we go with the talking snake. All right. So now, this is where Adam and Eve, eat the fruit from the tree that they're not supposed to eat. And the question that arises is, all right, this is, you have this original pair view where Adam and Eve are the first two humans, and then you have this pre-Adamic view where Adam and Eve are not the first two humans. But then if Adam and Eve are not the first two humans, there's a lot of questions that arise. All right, so why don't we just start trying to address those questions? First question is like, well, why doesn't the Bible, talk about just the creation of humans? Why does it just go to the creation of two specific humans? Well, because the biblical point is not really to, so Genesis, we have to go back to Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is not really about how God made everything. It's about different things that they worshipped as gods and different things that they thought the gods of Mesopotamia or Ugarit or Egypt were, big shots for creating. What it's saying is really Yahweh made that. Really Yahweh made that. And so the whole emphasis is to introduce the idea of monotheism, one supreme God that no other God even compares. These other gods who are telling you that they get credit for this and for that. No, they don't get any credit. They didn't do it. Yahweh did it. Yahweh did it, okay? It skips over a bunch of things. So Genesis 1 doesn't go over the creation of so for example, when it talks about the living creatures with which the water teems that God creates, I think on the 5th day, it's Nefesh. In other words, that's the sea mammals that, in their view, the creatures that had the breath of life, that, had a soul. It doesn't mean, every, it doesn't even go over every animal, So, I mean, there's that to be said. Now, some people think that Genesis 1 is talking about the creation of all humanity, and then Genesis 2 is talking about a specific two humans that God created. That's one possible view. I don't know about that because, if we get into it, there's some problems with that. But I mean, maybe. I can't really say for sure on that. But when we get to Adam and Eve, there are reasons. When we understand what their role is and what their job is, then that helps us understand how original sin works, and it helps us understand why the Bible would focus on them and just talk about them. So anyway, what we'll do is we'll skip forward to chapter 4 because, this is Genesis 3, and, Adam and Eve sin. And we all know, they eat the fruit they're not supposed to eat. Okay, let's skip forward to Genesis 4. And so, you've got Cain and Abel. Okay. And Cain is bad and he murders his brother Abel. Okay. Now, well, I hate to do it, but I know I just said let's skip to 4. Let's go through 3. All right. So here's the thing: because Adam and Eve are in this garden, in the presence of God, and they're dealing directly with Yahweh, then they are priests. In the view of the people who lived back then, they would have been priests. It says the Lord Yahweh Elohim took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. So he's got a job to maintain God's temple. That's a priest. And Yahweh Elohim, or Yahweh God, commanded the man, saying, "You may surely eat every tree of the garden, but the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die." Okay, so then Eve is created, and they're both in the garden, directly, with Yahweh. And then they disobey Yahweh, and they're no longer fit to be in Yahweh's temple anymore. in the presence. So, if we go back to chapter 1, let's just go back to chapter 1. It says, and God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures. What we were talking about just a minute ago. But let's go down to creation of humans. Or if you take it to just be Adam, it says, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the creeping lives, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. So what I'm about to tell you about this is called the Imago Dei, being created in the image of God. What I'm about to tell you comes from Michael Heiser's book and his work and what he talks about. What he says, he's a Hebrew scholar and an expert in these types of things. He says that the word in there is a strange situation where there are multiple different Hebrew words, and in English there's just the one word in for all of those words. So in English, in can kind of mean different things. So it's a preposition, and it can mean location. So it can mean like put the trash in the trash can, poo poo in the potty. The location of the poo poo is not in your pants; it is in the potty. Okay. It can mean like if you throw a baseball through a window, the window is in pieces, or you drop a plate, it's in pieces. It can mean like the general situation or the state of things. They can be in pieces anywhere. It's not a location. It's just, short for in two pieces, but we use the word in like that. All right, and then another way you can use it is I can say I work in lawn care, or somebody can say they work in medicine, or they work in ministry. What do you do? I'm in ministry. So that is a perfectly grammatically correct way to use the word in English. I don't hear people say it that much, but it's part of English. So the thing is, that is the sense of in here. It's occupational. So in other words, when God created man in his own image, that's a job. That's an occupational thing, which fits very nicely with the fact that all this stuff of him being a priest and Adam being the image of the God, the idol of the God. It's through Adam and Eve that you connect with the God, with Yahweh. Okay, so it's an occupational thing. So like you could, the Michael Heiser uses this term imager. Adam and Eve are God's imagers. So anyway, that's clearly what's going on here. So in a pre-Adamic view, where there are humans already on the earth, Adam and Eve still have a job to do, and they're still really important because their job is to, just like it says, they're created in God's image, and then that's their job title, and then they're given, the next verse, and God bless them, and they're given a command: be fruitful and multiply. So you need to make more of you. All right, fill the earth and subdue it. So subdue and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth, over every nefesh that moves on the earth. So generic, all right. So be fruitful and multiply. All right, the earth and subdue it. So the word subdue there, kabosh, let's have a look. Bring into subjection, bring into bondage. In other words, like it's literally like, you think of like put the earth in a submission hold. So why would God tell, Adam and Eve to put the earth into a submission hold, to dominate it, to take power, take control over the earth? Well, it's because their job is to be his representative. So they are in his presence as his priests, and then their job is to make the rest of the earth fit to be in Yahweh's presence. Okay? To make it the way that Yahweh wants it to be. Okay, so it's not a world that's, perfect. Eden was created by God, and the rest of the world is not Eden. But the idea would be that Adam and Eve are supposed to make the earth like Eden. Okay? Now, so there would be a role for Adam and Eve to play. In a pre-Adamic view, you would say, like, well, okay, Adam and Eve's job was to, go to a world that's full of humans and make them ready for to be in God's presence. And so then you ask yourself, like, why were they not ready to be in God's presence, and that sort of thing? Well, we'll get to that. Let's see. I don't want to go too far too fast, but I guess the other question is, like, well, why aren't these other humans mentioned? Well, because Adam and Eve would have been so important in the pre-Adamic view. Adam and Eve are still the ones that really matter. So I guess it's time to move forward now. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look, because we have to take a look at this question of original sin. So original sin, and Romans 5 is really like the big chapter for original sin. So in original sin, in an original pair view, where Adam and Eve are the first two humans, you would say, okay, Adam and Eve sinned, and everyone who ever lived after, all the people, are their descendants, and so we've all inherited original sin through our ancestors, Adam and Eve. So, like, it's not necessarily genetic, but it will be some sort of supernatural genetics, and it's like a propensity towards sin. All right, that's the view that Augustine came up with around 400 AD. That's Augustine's view of that, and that's pretty common standard Christian view. Okay, if you take a pre-Adamic view, you still have an original sin, but it would work differently, and you still have it here in Romans 5. It fits just fine with Romans 5, but it would work differently. So in that view, in the pre-Adamic view, Adam and Eve are not really, they're not the first humans, but they are God's chosen people, and they're very similar to Israel and later Jesus. Their job is to bring the world into a relationship with Yahweh. And just like Israel, they fail at what they've been chosen to do. Okay, so Romans 5, here's Romans 5:12. It says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, that would be Adam, okay, and death through sin, right? Remember, because they're sinners now, they're going to die, okay? And we won't go into that too much, but it says, and so death spread to all men because all sinned, okay? All right. I mean, how would that work? Okay, well, it says, for sin was in the world before the law was given, but sin is not counted where there is no law. Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come. All right. So, here's the issue. In a pre-Adamic view, you have Adam and Eve with a job to do. And in original pair view or pre-Adamic view, either way, they have a job. They are priests who are tasked with a job of making the world fit to be in Yahweh's presence. Okay. In an original pair view, they're supposed to do that with their children. In a pre-Adamic view, them and their children specifically are supposed to do that for the rest of the planet. And so what you would have are people on this planet who are basically intelligent primates who have no concept of God. So as Paul says, sin would be in the world. They wouldn't be right with God. But at the same time, sin would not be counted against them if they had no knowledge of what God commands or expects. Sin is not counted where there is no law. So they're not going to be held accountable for it. Okay. Adam's job would be to go to the world and go to the humans of the world who don't know anything about God and bring them to God. So, in other words, the reason those people aren't mentioned is because they're not really important. It's Adam who is here to help them, and it's Adam that's so important, because it's like why doesn't the book of Matthew talk about the people that lived in China? Why does it focus so much on Jesus? Well, Jesus is more important, and Jesus is more important for the people in China, So we go to Genesis 1 and we have an assumption that this is a book about how God made everything. But if you look at it in the original context, it's really more of, in the context of someone who read it back then, it's really more of a book about how the great things that you think your God did, really, Yahweh is the creator. Yahweh is the creator. So like it's like that thing that you think is a God, that you worship as a God, or you think that your God made that, or your God did that, or you think that is your God. Really, our God had that under control from day one. Our God made that. That was never an issue for our God, Like, so for example, when it says the earth was chaos and void, or something like that, formless and void, it's literally, on the first day, the earth is Tehom. Well, that's in Ugaritic. That's this chaos sea monster that one of their gods destroys and brings order to the universe. But the one of their gods, I think it's El or Baal, I think, has to defeat it. Well, in Genesis, it's a polemic on that. It's another one of these polemics, because it's like, no. That was always under Yahweh's control. He didn't have to fight a war, and they didn't have to get, like in the other stories, they have to have this big war. They have to go get their armies together. They have to have all these mighty weapons, and they have to kill the chaos monster to defeat primordial chaos. But in Genesis, the primordial chaos monster is already completely subdued under God's control, under Yahweh's control. Okay, so it's talking about, other things. It's not talking about God everything that God made. It's talking about the supernatural. And what you think is important with your gods is not. But what our God did is important. So anyway, so in Romans 5, that would be the view that so Adam and Eve and their descendants were supposed to make a world that did not know anything about God's law fit to be in God's presence. Okay, so then they didn't do that, and they became obedient to this serpent. So then you have to ask yourself, well, what would happen at that point? Adam is no longer, he's failed at doing his job. Adam and Eve both they had a job to do, and instead of doing what God told them to do, they did what the serpent told them to do. They became obedient to the serpent. Now they are no longer even allowed in God's garden, in God's temple. They're not even. So how are they going to complete this job? Now, it's important to say, God doesn't give up on Adam and Eve and their descendants. He continues to work, and there's going to continue to be setbacks. But God's not going to give up. And he even makes a promise to Eve that, she's going to have children, and they are going to make war with the serpent. Okay, so like we'll read that. So God curses the serpent. He doesn't really curse the man or the woman. He curses the land and the serpent. He says to the woman that I will put enmity between you and the woman. So, in other words, you and the woman will now become enemies. Okay. So, in other words, she wasn't the enemy. Hatred is another definition they're giving me here. So they weren't enemies, right? She did what he said. And she disobeyed God, said, yeah, I don't think God's got the right idea. I'm going to do what the serpent says. And God says, Yahweh says, like, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make you and the woman enemies. I'm going to put hatred between you. And then he goes into more specificity. He says, between your offspring and her offspring. In other words, your descendants and her descendants. So, in other words, in this view, Satan is definitely, or I call him Satan here, I have to be careful about that, but like the serpent, because, well, you'll understand that when we move on. The serpent is going to have an effect beyond just this. But so is what God is going to do through the woman. So God is not going to give up on his plan. But Adam and Eve, they didn't get fired, but they didn't get promoted. They got the opposite of a promotion. They got a demotion. But God's not giving up. God is going to, that's the thing, God is going to stick to what he said. And it seems like the serpent and then his other buddies tend to try to use that. They're like, okay, God's never going to go against what he said, so like we can work, he put these limitations on how he's going to do things, so like we can now stop him from succeeding because he's not going to, all we have to do is keep him from doing it his little way that he said he's going to do it. So it's like okay, I just corrupt. Satan can rule the earth as long as he stops what God's trying to do through Eve's children. Okay, but God promises that no, I'm going to win, and I'm going to defeat you. Okay, so, and I'm going to do it in the way that I originally intended. You messed up my Garden of Eden thing, but I'm still gonna win here, and everything that I promise I'm going to do is totally going to happen. Okay. Here's the thing. In a pre-Adamic view, you start to think about that, like, okay, if there's other people on the earth who they're not right with God, so they're sinful in that sense, but sin is not counted to them since they don't know God's laws, God's commands. And they were supposed to be taught about God by Adam and Eve and their descendants, but Adam and Eve have now been corrupted by the serpent. What would the serpent do at that point? Okay, the serpent is going to try to take over the world and corrupt everyone. Going to have more children, right? So in a pre-Adamic view, it's like, yeah, the serpent would go around the world and be hard to catch, just like a snake is hard to catch, and bite people and kill them, just like a snake. Okay, so you can think of it this way, like, what if you don't know anything about right and wrong, and then your first introduction to that comes from the devil. So then the world really would essentially have a huge sin problem that all goes back to, Adam's original sin. Okay? And I mean, there's a possibility here, I don't know, but it's possible that, like, since God had given Adam and Eve dominion over the earth, then the earth was there, they were supposed to run it. and they had authority, so that Satan didn't have authority to take control of the earth. But when they become obedient to Satan, and now he tells them what to do, and they disobey God, or Yahweh, now the earth is his. That, in other words, that like Adam and Eve ceded their authority by becoming obedient to the serpent. Okay. Now you may ask yourself, I mean, there's some obvious questions. It's like, okay, well, what about, it seems almost unfair, that like, you have these people on this planet, who are like Homo sapiens, but they have no concept of God or morality or right and wrong. And then Satan is their, the devil whispering in their ear, tempting them as like their first introduction to that. Like, seriously, that sounds bad. Well, it sounds unfair. Well, from a biblical view, God has not left himself without a witness. So, like, Psalm 19 talks about this. We're reading the NIV here. It says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge." So, you can't, it's not like, from a biblical view, God's creation still tells you something about God. What Psalm 19 goes on to say is you can learn more about God by having the actual commands of God, or the laws of God, which would have been what Adam and Eve were supposed to bring to the world through their descendants. But you don't have you still would know something. God wouldn't have left himself without a witness. Nonetheless, it's not good for you to be someone who like has no concept of right and wrong, and then your first introduction of that to be Satan. It's like children. We've all seen it. So what I'm talking about seems kind of crazy, to have people running around who are like on this planet that like don't really have a system of morality, but it's like, well, now it sounds a lot like childlike innocence, that like children who grow up with parents who are a bad influence tend to be influenced to be bad by those bad parents. But not all of them. Sometimes they recognize that's not really the way to be. But we all have seen it, that, like father like son, like father like daughter too. Okay, so in a pre-Adamic view, that would be how original sin works. In an original pair view, it would be, an inherited propensity, would certainly be on the table. But there's nothing really, there's nothing really in Romans 5. You don't have to take it that way. And then, the pre-Adamic view fits nicely with Romans 5, because Romans 5 says, that Adam was a type of Christ, a type of the one who was to come. That Adam was supposed, a type, or a type is, it means like a typological prophecy. So in the Bible you have prophecies where God literally, Yahweh tells the prophet da da da, and the prophet goes and says, "Hear the word of Yahweh da da da." And oftentimes those prophecies are about the future. Well, typological prophecies are generally always about the future, and they are, instead of saying what's going to happen, you have something that happened in the past that is very similar to what is going to happen. So, like, according to Paul right here, Adam is a type of Christ. And that fits nicely with the pre-Adamic view, because you have Adam, who was supposed to go and bring the world into a right relationship with God. But you had a world that, wasn't corrupted. And then Adam, blew that. But then Jesus flips that around. And Jesus comes to a world that's completely corrupted and transforms it. Okay, so here's the thing. If we go to Genesis chapter 4, and, Cain and Abel, Cain is obviously, tempted to be evil. And he murders his brother. And then God is not happy with him. And then Cain complains to God, and God punishes Cain. So God says, you know what? You'll never be able to farm again. You'll have to just basically be a hunter-gatherer. It says you shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. You have to go just find stuff. Okay, you'll never be able to farm the land again. That's what he says. This is curse. And Cain says to Yahweh, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So it's like, well, now wait a minute. Why is Cain worried about somebody killing him? In the story, we're only introduced to Adam and Eve and their two sons, Cain. And Cain's now killed Abel. So, I mean, there's no one to kill him except Adam and Eve. Like, he says he's going to wander around the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. That fits really well with a pre-Adamic view that, like, you had people on the earth who, they may kill you, but they weren't really immoral for doing it. So, like, if a shark kills a seal, it doesn't murder the seal, it just kills it. There's just people who don't know any better. Nonetheless, this fits nicely with a pre-Adamic view. But you could take it another way, and you could say, like, well, he's worried about other descendants of Adam and Eve. And it's like, well, okay, like future descendants of Adam and Eve. Okay, as I understand it, and this is another thing I'm getting from Michael Heiser, as I understand it, in this view, he would definitely be worrying about future descendants because there's no, like, gap of time way that, like, Adam and Eve, in the way the text lays, you have to go back to the original language and ask yourself, is it skipping? And I think in his view, it's not skipping. So, like, bottom line, you can take this either way. You can say, well, he was worried about future people that are going to descend from Adam and Eve, or because it does say that they had, more children. That totally happens. Or you could say he was worried about, other people that existed on this planet. Okay. So, I mean, the bottom line is you could take it either way. Original sin works either way. Adam and Eve, the reason why the focus is on Adam and Eve makes perfect sense either way. And you can take this stuff in Genesis 4. I mean, because then it's like, it says the Lord said to him, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Then Cain went away from the presence of Yahweh and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife. Again, a woman who, I mean, it just, like, where did she come from, right? And she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built a city, he named it after the city he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Okay, so, I mean, he built a city when it's just him and his wife and their son. And then you have, more people and all this. So, and then you have, I mean, from a scientific perspective, it's just a few generations and they're developing, pastoral shepherdry, farming. They're developing musical instruments, metalworking, like, those are all things that fit better, with a later time period, but people were, there were already people on the planet that we don't know much about, who don't have writing, who did, if you go back far enough, the earliest written things I think are around 5000 BC, and it's a bunch of receipts found in Mesopotamia, Sumeria. It's a pile of old receipts where they were buying and selling stuff. So anyway, there's the two views there. They both fit. they both you could take the text either way. So what we're going to have to do as we move through this is we're going to have to, when we get to the flood and when we get to the Tower of Babel, we're going to have to ask ourselves, oh my goodness, which way should I take it? Which way is the way? Which way is the right way? Which way is the wrong? Well, we don't know. But when we get to the flood and when we get to Babel, we're going to have to say, all right, what is the original pair view of this, and what is the pre-Adamic view of this? Now, everyone you look up online who says they're teaching about pre-Adamic, it seems like only nutty people talk about this. But the bottom line is, it is legitimate. It's just not popular. And you can insert explanation here. Okay, so let's go to Genesis 5. So it says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God, in the image of God. All right. Anyway, male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image, and he named him Seth. So you're going to have this genealogy in here. And it's going to give you, so the days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years. So you have some things that, like, where you would raise scientifically there is scientific evidence that says that this can't be true. Like, first of all, a person that lives 930 years, is a major problem scientifically. You could say, like, well, God performed a miracle here. Well, the problem is when God performs a miracle, it tends to point out that God performs a miracle. It's not like you just assume that so that wouldn't, it points out that God did something. It doesn't say that God did this. It's just like he just naturally lived 930 years. And then you can make some sort of assumption that, like, well, it was sin that was, like, slowly creeping through. Well, that's just a big assumption you're making. Like, why did it stop at people living, to be 70? Why is it going back up now? Like, why don't we only live 100 days? By this point we should be all living real short lives of sin where it's like that, So anyway, there's that issue. Then there's the other issue that, like, if you take the time from when Adam, it says he had lived 130 years, and he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. Alright, so, and again, so Adam and Eve, 130 years old, and then Seth was born. Seth is he's not Cain or Abel, it's their next one. I guess their third kid. Let's go back to Genesis 4. So, alright. Last verse, it says, Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called him Seth. And she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. Okay. So anyway, you've got all this. And it says after Seth was born, he had other sons and daughters. Alright, so if you add up the time, you have this list of these people from father, son, father, son, father, son. Genealogy list. And if you add up the time between when the father, how long he lived before he had his son, and then you take that and it goes all the way to Noah, and then you go over to Genesis 11, I think it's 11. It's either 10 or 11. And it goes, I think it's 11. And it goes from Noah all the way to Abraham. And then you have other stuff in the Bible that talks about how long it was from Abraham all the way to, like, Moses, and you've got Moses and the time all the way to, like, King Solomon or David, and then King Solomon is like an actual historical figure that, like, not that these other people aren't actual historical figures. That's what I was saying. That Adam and Eve are actual historical figures, but the thing is, King Solomon is someone that, like, is well known outside of the Bible to have existed. Like, this is a mass. In the days of David and Solomon, the Jews had a massive empire in the Middle East. So it's datable through various methods. So like we know when that is, and then we work backwards with these lists in the Bible, then we get Adam and Eve lived in 6000 BC. Or 4000 BC. When it's like, that tends to be a bit of a problem. And then we've got the time of Noah being 2400 BC is when the Noah flood happened. Okay, like the Great Pyramids were built in Egypt in 2600 BC. But then the Bible says, that's what modern archaeologists are saying, that the Great Pyramids were built in Egypt in 2600 BC. That the earliest known written documents go back to, like, I think 4,000, or 3,000. I forget how far. It's way back. And then we've got like some earlier. The earliest known human like stonework in the Middle East is Göbekli Tepe. I think it goes back to like 10,000 BC. And then you've got like. So for example, the Bible says that the descendants spread out throughout the earth after Noah, and one of those, the nation of the Egyptians, came from Noah's descendants. So, but the Great Pyramids would have been built in Egypt in 2600 BC, 200 years before Noah's flood in 2400 BC. And it's like, okay, so this is like a major objection. Not only that, you've got scientists who tell us, yes, all humans that live on the planet today are the descendants of one man and one woman. But when they lived is not real clear. But at the earliest, it would be 100,000 years ago or more. It's like 100, sometimes it's 400, it's somewhere in there. It never is outside of those bounds. So, like, they're not sure, but they are sure that we all are descendants of one man and one woman today. All people on the planet today. So, but still, that's far more than, 4,000 BC. I do think, like, the earliest signs of city life and civilization in Mesopotamia are 5,000 BC, if I can remember right. So, that's Anyway, here's the point. There is tremendous evidence within the biblical text that the biblical text wants you to take this particular part metaphorically. So in this case, we would assume literal, except for we have these reasons. So what are said reasons? Well, when you get to Abraham is one of the most important people in all of the biblical history, and especially in Genesis. The whole book of Genesis pivots and focuses on Abraham. That's like everything builds up to Abraham, and then once you have Abraham, it's like, okay, he becomes the basis of everything else. He's like the Aristotle of Genesis, So he's like the Newton of Genesis. So anyway, God comes to Abraham and tells him he's going to have a son when he's 100, and he lies down. I think it's when he's 85, actually, just before he has Ishmael, and he lies down with his face in the ground. He bows down to God, but he laughs with his face in the ground, and because he thinks it's a joke that he would have a son when he's that old. He winds up having a son at 100, and then his wife Sarah also hides in the tent when Yahweh comes and says, or actually the angel of Yahweh, if I remember right, comes and says, which is also Yahweh, which is another crazy thing in there. She hides in the tent and laughs when Yahweh says she's going to have a child. They're going to have a child. Because she's 90. And she's never had a child in her life. She's never going to have a child. And now she's 90 and she's going to have a child. And so she laughs. She thinks it's a joke. Well, here's the thing. If you go to Let's see. Genesis 11. Alright, so here's the thing. Oftentimes we take a look at this and we focus on Genesis 5 and we leave out Genesis 11. But Genesis 11 gives us a lot of information about this. So first of all, you have Abraham's dad. Alright. Terah. Okay. I'm seeing a bit of a textual problem here. One of my sources was telling me that Abraham's dad lived to be 130, and then he had his son Abram. But now I'm looking this up in the ESV and it says 70. So I smell a rat. Still though, he was 70 having a kid. Anyway, well, this is quite interesting. I'm going to type it in. We may be about to find some... sometimes the biblical translators like to hide the truth. You know, as Michael Heiser puts it, and I didn't get this information from him, but as Michael Heiser puts it, how do I put it? You don't need protection from your Bible, but sometimes translators think you do. Okay. All right. Oh. Okay, so it's a bit of a textual thing that I don't understand. So I just learned something while making the video. It says when Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Alright, so then I'm reading on here. Oh! Okay. It's based on what Stephen says in Acts 7 when he recounts this whole history. So the numbers come from there. So Terah lived 70 years and begat the first of his 3 sons. But Abram wouldn't have been born because of the events that Stephen talks about in Acts 7. He would have been 130 when he gave birth to Abraham. Okay. Where Stephen gets that from Acts 7 is a whole other interesting question that I don't think we need to go into, but it's a well-known thing that I don't know, the Old Testament that they had wasn't exactly the same. The New Testament authors were working with an Old Testament that was older, and we've been lucky enough in the Dead Sea Scroll finds to find older copies of the Old Testament, and it's pretty much the same. But there are a few little points, like Goliath, for example, was really 6'5", not 9'9", which, given that everyone was around 5 or 5'3", he would have been a giant to them at 6'5", but he's not 9'9". So that's what we found an older copy of Samuel. It's amazing how accurate it is, but there are a few points where there's clearly been some changes with some of these, and so the New Testament is often used as a way of correcting our later copies of the Old Testament. So there's some details there. When Stephen quotes this story, he apparently has access to a more accurate copy of the Old Testament. So I mean, I don't know, if you believe that Stephen, in the book of Acts should be trusted, then here's the point. Abraham's father, Terah, was 130 when he gave birth to Abraham. So here's the issue. Why would Abraham, therefore, think that it was a joke for him to have a child? Why did he think it was a joke for him to have a child at 100? So this is what I'm talking about, like a blatant slap-in-the-face contradiction. And they do have a child, and it's clear that it's a miracle of God. And they name the child Isaac, which means laughter. Or it's like the joke baby. Okay, the baby it's a joke that we had this kid. And so that would be one of the blatant slap-in-your-face contradictions that I'm talking about. So that was interesting. Now let's see if we can find Genesis. Yeah, okay. Anyway, we're not going to look it up because I can never remember where it is. But anyway, when Abraham dies, he dies at I think it's 175, and it says he died at a good old age, old and full of years, and was gathered. Okay. But he didn't die at a good old age, old and full of years. So Shem, the son of Noah, who was on the ark with Noah, when he was 100 years old, he fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And after he fathered Arpachshad, he lived 500 years and had other sons and daughters. Okay, so 500 years is, he lived to be 600. He was a contemporary with Abraham most of Abraham's life. Because if you add up these numbers, he would have been a contemporary of Abraham. Alright? They would have lived. And then Shem's grandson, well, no, it's not Shem's grandson. It would have been Shem's, so Shem fathered Arpachshad. Arpachshad fathered Shelah. Shelah fathered Eber. So Shem's great-grandson, Eber, lived... I don't know. You got to go back and do the numbers. One of these guys back here, I forgot which one it is, would have outlived Abraham. So here's the thing. How would Abraham be dying at a good old age, old and full of years at 175? To us, that would have been amazing. 175, I mean, it's like pushing the limits of, what's imaginably possible. But 600, 403, no, that's just like way out of bounds. Well, in the view of Genesis, Abraham died at a good old age at 175, old and full of years. So he wasn't full of years if people lived to be 600. This is a blatant contradiction. So we've got two here with these genealogy lists, making the point that these shouldn't be taken literally. Okay? So then the question becomes okay, if they're not literal, what are they? Well, the problem is you could say well, okay, in their ancient culture, numbers had all sorts of meanings, and maybe there's some sort of meaning in the numbers. People have worked to death on figuring that out, and the problem is there's other ancient copies of this that have slightly different numbers, which throws the whole thing off. Then we've got there's other issues. So Genesis 5, if all of the names in the list, Adam means man, right? Alright, his son Seth means appointed, because Eve said, God has appointed me another child. Okay, after Abel died. And then Enosh means mortal. So anyway, the names, you take the names and you write the meaning of the name, and you get this. Man appointed mortal sorrow, the blessed of God, shall come down, teaching, his death shall bring, the despairing, rest. So it forms, like, when you see something like that, you begin to say it would make sense that this was be taken metaphorically. So then you ask yourself, like, well, the genealogy from Jesus to Adam seems literal, and Adam seems literal. It's like, yeah, but they probably skipped to, like, the important people, you know. They left out, to kind of make the whole thing fit, to have some, because it had some sort of symbolic additional meaning, and, that is apparently lost to us. But those blatant contradictions are there, so it's definitely not to be taken literally, you know. Kenneth Kitchens, who I've got his book here, it says On the Reliability of the Old Testament. He's one of the world's leading Egyptologists. He's also, I think he's retired now, but that doesn't matter. But, like, he thinks, given they have the same thing in these other Mesopotamian stories, and, like, they have the really, really long ages before the flood, and then after the flood, they start out really long, and they slowly get to, like, normal length. He says that would have been a way of them saying it had just been a super long time. Like, super long time. So, like, especially with people, reigning on the throne 24,000 years. So, here's the thing. If you are trying to cover a super amount of time, then you will cut out more. I mean, in other words, like, if Adam really did live 100,000 years ago, then you would definitely put, not cover everything that happened in those 100,000 years. You would definitely abbreviate it. So the longer the period that you're trying to cover, the more motivation you have to abbreviate it. The more reasonable it comes to put gaps in, or something like that, So, there's something else I should probably say, but I'm not going to remember it. I'm struggling to remember it. So anyway, let's go to the next chapter. Genesis 6:1. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Well, okay, let's go ahead and talk about the words. So first of all, took as their wives. It doesn't mean wives. That's just the way it comes through in English. It just means, like, women they slept with. So it's not, they didn't get married. They didn't have a preacher. I pronounce you husband and wife. They didn't do that. They just had sex. Okay, so anyway, who are the sons of God? Well, the view that's super duper common in churches is that the sons of God, and even on Answers in Genesis apparently, who believe in a global flood in 2400 BC, and that the earth and the universe was created 6,000 years ago, even Answers in Genesis is not willing to say that these are gods rebelling against Yahweh, coming down, mating with human women, and producing demigod offspring. Even Answers in Genesis isn't willing to go there. But the bottom line is, it really, I mean, it's one of those things, like, that really does seem to be what the Bible's saying here. And, like, the reason, I think part of the reason people are comfortable with, like, just making really bad interpretations of this text is because they'll always preface it with saying, now, however you take this, it doesn't affect salvation or basic theology, so you can kind of do what you want with this. So we're not forced, so, like, people will believe in the supernatural, because it's like, okay, we're conservative Christians, we got to believe that Jesus rose from the dead and performed miracles, and we'll go to heaven, and that God exists and created the universe. But, like, this story, no, we don't have to believe that. So, oh yeah, it's a liberal interpretations galore. So there's something like that. How do they interpret it? They say the sons of God meant the descendants of Seth, and the daughters of man were the descendants of Cain. And so it's like it's very hypothetical. Like, you just kind of create this, like, why would you every time you see the term sons of God in the Old Testament, it always refers to, in the other, there's 4 times, and this is one of the 4. On the other 3 times, it's always, it's B'nai Elohim. All right, so you know what Elohim is, right? It's sons of the heavenly creature realm. So every time you see that phrase, sons of God, in the Old Testament, in the other 4 times, there's no way to take it in the context other than it means divine beings who are there with Yahweh. Now, the question becomes like, okay, does the Bible teach polytheism here? You know, no, the Bible's quite clear that Yahweh is different, and that there's no. Let's just look up some verses on that so we can deal with that. There's no God. Let's see. All right, so I just Googled "no one is like God." All right, so a bunch of verses come up. There is none like you, O Yahweh. You are great, and your name in might. Great is your name in might. There's no one holy like Yahweh. Indeed, there is no one beside you, nor is there any rock like our God. O Yahweh, there is none like you, nor is there any God besides you, according to all that we have heard with our ears. All right. All right, so 1 Kings 8:23. He said, O Yahweh, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant and showing loving kindness to your servants who walk before you with all your heart. Psalm 86:8. There is no one like you among the gods, O Lord, O Yahweh, nor are there any works like yours. Remember the former things long past, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me. So anyway, it's also commonly taught, at least when I was growing up in churches, that the other gods that people worship in the ancient world of other nations were imaginary, and that the biblical view is that the other gods are completely imaginary. But that does run into problems. One of the problems is these sons of God, in the other uses. So for example, it's clear that, even if you take it in Genesis 6 and you say, oh, that means, the human line of Seth, it's like, well, in the other 3 passages, it's clearly referring to divine beings. Today we would refer to them as angels, but they do exist in the other passages. Like, so for example, there's 2 in Job, and I forget where the other one is, but you're right there at the beginning of Job. So why don't we just take a look at that? Job 1. All right, so Job 1. All right. There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan, or the accuser, also came among them. Then Yahweh said to Satan, "From where have you come?" All right. So anyway, it says the sons of God came to present themselves before Yahweh. This is definitely not on earth. You know. So anyway, So, we've got the serpent in the garden and that sort of thing. A major problem is like all of these verses that talk about essentially monotheism, and it talks about how God is greater than the gods of other nations. If those gods of other nations don't exist, then it's a rather silly comparison because, like, last Friday I was working cleaning up somebody's yard. There was a lot of trash in their yard, and I found a brand new pencil on the ground, and I grabbed it, and instead of throwing it away with all the other stuff on the ground, I kept it because it's a good brand new wooden pencil. Okay, well, that wooden pencil is far greater than an imaginary god. Like the cats that come and eat the food that I throw out in the backyard are far greater and have more glory than an imaginary god. So that's a bit of a problem for that view. You've got in Job where, it's clear other divine beings exist. There's no way around it. And we're going to get more into that, I guess, as we go. The book of Deuteronomy in chapter 32 just flat out says that when the other nations worship God, they're worshiping demons. And we'll take a look at that as we go. Now, there are passages in the Bible that say that like God is a father to like David, and David is a son to God, or something like that. Or it also talks about Israel as God's wife, and Yahweh as Israel's husband, and that Israel is like a bad wife who is constantly going off, as it would say, whoring herself to other gods. That's a rude terminology, but that is what it says. But anyway, the phrase "sons of God" in the other three times it's used, that particular phrase "sons of God" always refers to these divine beings. The term angels and demons are a terminology that was created after the Old Testament was concluded and before the New Testament was started up. So after the Old Testament was concluded, a very similar thing happened to what happened after the New Testament was concluded. So when the New Testament was concluded, Christians started interpreting it, going back and forth, arguing. One of the biggest debates they had was the Christological debates about like, okay, is Jesus fully God, fully man, or like did he only appear to be a human but was all God? Or was it a good man that got possessed by a god? Or, was it like just a man who, was adopted by God, and like all these different views, and eventually they rejected all those views, and it's like, no, fully man, fully God. Okay, was he like a lesser God, was he created by God? It's like, that was Arianism, and it was like, no. So like, my point is this. Christians debated the theology of the New Testament and tried to create a coherent creed and a system that sort of summarizes and takes into account everything that the New Testament taught them about Jesus and about God and about the Holy Spirit. And so they created the word Trinity, which is not in the New Testament, it's not in the Bible. It is a Christian creation as a way of summarizing the things that are said in there and putting it into a system. The same things happened in between the New Testament and the Old Testament, which is called the Second Temple period. So when the Jews came back, they got to build the Temple of Solomon. It was the second one, not the Solomon, but the next one. And all of the Jewish literature in between the Old Testament and the New Testament is called Second Temple literature. And what they did is they tried to create theological systems to sort of sum up all of the stuff. And theological systems are good in a way, and they're also bad in a way. What's good about them is they help you like make sense of things and understand things and remember things and sort of organize all of the different scattered information into a framework so that you can read stuff and it makes sense to you. They're basically a good learning tool. It's basically a summary of what's said in there. And sometimes when you're creating a summary, you simplify the terminology to, like, the word Trinity. It's just a simplified way of saying what the New Testament says. Well, they did the same thing, and in between the Testaments, in the Second Temple period, they simplified the terminology of the Old Testament into just angels and demons. And so the terms angels and demons, that's where they come from. That's how they become like just the default terminology. And people, the Jews in that period, knew that the real terminology was more complicated than that, but that was their way of summing it up, and that was sort of their theological system for organizing what the Old Testament had taught and said. Now, the problem with theological systems is that you can become more married to the system than to the source of the system. So, like, sometimes you have people who are like, they'll reject a Bible verse because it doesn't fit with their system, and the system's man-made. It's helpful, but sometimes we become more connected. So like a church, they don't teach you the Bible, really, they teach you a system, because that's why systems are created. They're learning tools, and they're memorization tools, and they're organization tools, so that's why you learn systems. But then, like, people find out that their system was wrong when they get older, and they don't want to reject their system or modify their system because they're more married to the system than to the Bible, which is supposed to be the foundation of the system. So, like, in the Second Temple period, they took a bunch of things. So, like, the term angel is a Greek word that just means messenger. And oftentimes these divine beings in the Old Testament are called messengers in Hebrew, and it's translated into Greek as angel, and then that word becomes the word that they use in the New Testament for basically any good divine being, any good Elohim, basically. The Old Testament would have called them all Elohim. So the Old Testament has like a more complicated vocabulary. You could say a richer vocabulary, a more detailed vocabulary for these things. And the New Testament tends to sort of summarize it. So that's going on. So when you read the New Testament, they're in Second Temple period terminology. But then on top of that, there's stuff in the Second Temple theological systems that clearly got a little bit crazy, and like it's like, I don't know if you can really base that on the Old Testament. And so it's important to understand that they didn't necessarily just believe everything. So for example, the book of Enoch has tons of stuff. And it's clear that in 2 Peter is referencing the book of Enoch. It's clear that the book of Jude references the book of Enoch. And it's like, did they believe the book of Enoch was like an authoritative, God-inspired scripture? No, not necessarily, because those ideas in that book that they reference would have had a life bigger than that book. But those ideas were within that culture, in that milieu, and they're all around, and that's what they're working with. And so, maybe that helps us understand it. Yeah. In Second Temple literature, in Second Temple theology, they took the view, like, no one ever took a view of this passage as anything other than this. These are gods under the service of Yahweh who rebelled and came down to earth and then created giants, demigod offspring. They're called the Nephilim here. And that's the view that everyone took until 400 AD, when Augustine took it the other way with the sons of Seth and the daughters of Cain. So, not that Augustine's a bad guy, but just because Augustine said it doesn't mean it's right. Augustine had some really important, really good things to say too. So I don't want to trash Augustine. But anyway. One thing that can be confusing for us with this terminology is when it says the sons of God, the term sons would have had more meaning for them back then than it does for us. Remember, it's sons of Elohim, so it means sons of being that belong in the divine realm. And by the way, Elohim is a term it's a location-based term. It describes where they live. But they also had like ontological terms that describe what these beings are. So you could say I am an American, or you could say I am a human. Human is ontological, it describes what I am. American describes where I reside, where I'm from, where I live. So Elohim is a location term. They would often call them shining ones in the Old Testament as a term for like describing like what they are. Like, so like apparently one of the things these divine beings had in common is they emit light. You know, they shine like stars. That was the comparison they made. That light comes out of them. You know, and they would also have other points of their description, but that was often a term, you know, for them. Now the thing is, the term sons in the ancient culture would have meant a child of somebody's child, but it also meant somebody who had authority and ran things. So in that culture, the father was the big head honcho and had all the authority and really had legal authority. The government stepped in to deal with problems between families, but as long as the father was alive, within that family, and they would have large families, and the richer the father. So for someone to have a lot of sons meant that they were rich and powerful and had a huge amount of land. So like these sons would have been the big shot administrators, and they would have put their family in charge of all sorts of things. So for example, the term Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, it literally means great house. So it means that like he's got a bunch of people under his house, who are his children that like run things. So it might be more helpful to instead of thinking of it as the sons of God, it might be more helpful to think of it as the princes of God. So sons of God wouldn't have been necessarily just any old divine being. It wouldn't have been like just a messenger, like an angel. Angel means messenger. It would have been like one of the big shots. And it appears that there's 70 of them. Eventually, there may have been more than 70, but when this happens in Genesis 6, it's a bad thing from the biblical perspective. But for a long time, we were confused about this story because we didn't know, like, what is this about? What is this? It's referencing this story from the ancient world, and we don't know what that story is. Well, as of now, we know what the story is. As of 2010, the paper's been published. Oh my goodness, I'm going to look it up for you. As of 2010, it was finally discovered that the story, the Apkallu story in Mesopotamian mythology, is the Nephilim story that the Bible's talking about. So that was all right. Anyway, the point is, and this is the point that Michael Heiser makes, is that any commentary on Genesis that is before 2010 and doesn't at least deal with the Apkallu story and the findings that we have is now no longer. It's out of date. It's outdated. You can't interpret this while still ignoring the Apkallu story. Oh my goodness, I can't find the. He gives you the scholarly article that came out. It wasn't from him in 2010, and I'm having a trouble finding it. But anyway, the Apkallu story. Oh my goodness, I just wanted to give you the name of the article. So anyway, it's not that important, I guess. But anyway, these Apkallu are all throughout the mythology, but that what this particular scholar did is he was able to figure out that is the basis for the Genesis 6 Nephilim story. So, first of all, it's pretty clear that Nephilim means giants. That's the traditional translation of it, and into English. And then later in the Old Testament, when you run into the Nephilim, they're always described as being far larger than regular people, that's aka a giant. Okay, so anyway, and that's how they translated it. In 200 BC, when the Hebrews translated the Old Testament into Greek, they translated it as "tada gigantes." So anyway, the Apkallu story is all throughout Mesopotamian mythology, and it's seen in their mythology. The Apkallu are like the wise men who teach everyone. They are why the Sumerians and the Babylonians are awesome, because they have this connection to the Apkallu, and that's why we're awesome, and that's why they're like sages, like wise men. They're also described as like fish people because they somehow survived the flood, and it's such a good thing. The Apkallu are such a good thing. Well, in Genesis, the Apkallu are a bad thing. So this is another one of those polemics where it's like, oh, it's a bad thing. So like and what the scholar was able to point out is that the little bit that we have in Genesis 6:1-4 is, except for verse 3, which says that it's a bad thing, but the other verse 1, 2, and 4 clearly point out that they point for point go the same as the Apkallu story, and they're all throughout. I mean, they used to put statues of the Apkallu in the cornerstones of their houses, and they called the Apkallu the Watchers, which is Second Temple Jews. They saw this connection, Second Temple period Jews, and they referred to these people as the Watchers. Watchers as in divine beings that watch us that decided to come down. So anyway, and then we have to talk about this. Second Peter and the reference to this. Alright, so kind of smoking gun thing, I mean, the bottom line is, if you take this as a view, if you take a non-supernatural view of this particular passage, it's just fraught with problems, and one of the problems is here. So Peter is going to use Second Temple period terminology, so he's going to use terms like angels and stuff. But anyway, 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 1. But false prophets arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who brought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their sensuality, and because of them the way of truth will be blasphemed. And in their greed they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, their destruction is not asleep. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment. When is he talking about angelic sins? In the days of Noah. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. Okay, so does he mean those angels sinned way before Noah, or does he mean in the days of Noah? Because Genesis 6 is talking about something that happened in the days of Noah. Well, it makes it clear because it goes, the next verse says, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if you rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. So there's a thing here. It's like this happened, but when that happened, there was one guy that was good, and then you have the same thing, Sodom and Gomorrah. This happened, and then when that happened, there was one guy who was good. Okay. So he makes a connection, and then the connection goes further because he says that the sin of these angels was like the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. They indulge in the lustful passion and defiling passion and despise authority. So they have eyes full of adultery. So it's a sexual sin, they're talking about. So anyway, let's keep going with this. All right, the book of Jude talks about it. All right. And so the book of Jude goes to the same thing, the same connection. It says, angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling. Sounds a lot like Genesis 6, right? He kept them in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. So here's the thing. What that means is he's making the connection explicit that the angels who left their position and their position of authority and their proper dwelling engaged in similar sexual immorality as the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah wanted to have sex with the angels. They were going to, they seemed to want to rape the angels. Okay, so there you go. So I guess the people who say, that it's just sons of God are Sethites and daughters of man are descendants of Cain, they just hope you don't read Jude and 2 Peter. So anyway, and again with this Apkallu mythology, it's clear that's what it's talking about. So from the perspective of Genesis, there's no reason to take this metaphorically. From the perspective of Genesis, this is clearly literal and supernatural. This happened. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, which is a sexual metaphor for them, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Which we now know that's in the... So here's the thing, and my voice is going, so I'm going to have to stop for now, and we'll come back and we're going to talk about the flood. But we need to talk about why the flood happened in the biblical view. This will be the last point. The biblical view of why the flood happened. Murder is the biblical view of why the flood happened. So Cain kills Abel, and then Genesis 4 goes through an escalation of murder. How murder, it just makes the point that murder is escalating. That, one of Cain's descendants brags and says, Cain killed Abel, but I've killed... Well, let's just go back and just read it. So remember, Cain kills Abel. That happens. Alright. So one of his descendants, Lamech, says to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Okay, so the point of view is that there's an escalation of murder. But it seems to go off the charts here. Genesis 5 is just the genealogy, and then you get to Genesis 6, talks about what happens again. And it says that, this Apkallu Nephilim thing happens. Okay, and in the Second Temple period, they took the view that unclean spirits were the spirits of dead Nephilim, which were demigod offspring of these sons of God, who now didn't have a human body to inhabit, and that's why they want to possess people. Is that the view that the New Testament talks about? That's not clear, but that is a view that Second Temple Jews came to, which you can't really. It's not on real strong ground, but anyway, just want to point out that that's there, and also want to point out that Peter in 2 Peter, when he talks about them being these beings being chained in gloomy darkness, he uses the term tartarao, which is where our English word Tartarus comes from, which in Tartarus, in Greek mythology, the world was once ruled by an earlier generation of gods who were giants, who were defeated by the next generation of gods, and put in a terrible region of the underworld called Tartarus. And, the banishing of an older god to the underworld is definitely all throughout this, all throughout this whole region of the mythology. So it's huge. So let's see. So this Nephilim thing happens, and it says, "Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever." Or then Yahweh said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years." And then, it says, Yahweh saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thought of his hearts was only evil continually. So Genesis sees it as a terrible thing. Instead of leading the world into greatness, it's leading the world into it's terrible. Okay? And in Genesis, this is why the flood happens. Okay? Now, you get down a little bit further, and it explains more specifically what the evil was. Genesis 6:11 says, "Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence." Okay? And God said to Noah, "I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth." Okay? And, the whole local flood, global flood thing, we're going to talk about that later. The point we're talking about right now is the violence thing. Okay? So, it's violence that's the issue. You skip forward to chapter 9, and this is after the flood. So they get off, they get off the flood. Moses makes sacrifice, and then God lays down some rules. Okay, and he says that. All right, where is it? All right, so God establishes some rules. I'm gonna talk about one other rule that's not really all that relevant, but it's kind of cool. He says that they can eat animals, but he says, "You shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood." Okay, so here's the thing. In the ancient world, they didn't have refrigerators, and so it wasn't uncommon in the Bronze Age, in Noah's day, to cut a piece of an animal off and then bandage it up so that it won't bleed out, and then you can come cut another piece off later. And people used to do that to animals. In the Jewish view, it's okay to kill animals because animals have no concept of their own mortality. They're not aware of that. They're not like Adam and Eve, who live with the knowledge that they will die one day. And they're not like all people that live with that knowledge. Animals don't really think about that. They're not aware of that. They don't have that level of mental awareness. But they do understand pain. And so this passage right here is the basis for the Jewish requirement. When you eat an animal, you have to let it bleed out so that it's dead, and therefore the animal, in other words, eating animals and killing animals is okay because the animal has no concept of that, but cruelty is not okay. So when you kill an animal and eat it, you have to kill it. You have to drain all its blood, and you have to shed its blood. And so if your blood is shed, it's like if you take, then all the blood is completely out of the animal. It's been shed of its blood. So anyway, so you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. Okay, so, in other words, murder is, this is a command to execute murderers. So, in the biblical view, that's exactly what God was doing in the flood. He was executing murderers. And that's why you have a command here as soon as they get off the ark. It's like, okay, from now on, if anybody is a murderer, you have to execute them. Okay, so Instead of bragging, I mean, before you had Cain killing his brother because he wanted to, and then his descendant is bragging to his wives about who he killed. And then the world becomes murder world because of, essentially, you have the first rebel, the serpent in the garden, and then you have another rebellion of evil spirits. And the Bible has a theme of evil spirits, evil gods, evil divine beings, whatever you want to call them, fallen angels, lead the people into more evil. So the serpent does it, and then these sons of God do it. These fallen angels do it. And then it becomes murder world, and so God executes everyone. And then he tells Noah when they get off the ark, you can't be doing this anymore. Okay, so there's that. Alright guys, what we're going to do is stop right there with this video and the sort of after the first 4 verses of Genesis 6, and we're not going to go into the flood and the rest of what we're going to look at in Genesis. We're going to save that for another video. But to end this first video off of this little 2-parter, I do want to go back and examine this question of pre-Adamite versus original pair just a little bit more, because it's important to analyze, like, okay, where do these two views end you up, basically what I want to look at, since the pre-Adamite view is kind of like not the normal view, what possible objections could there be to it? Now, some of those objections we're going to take a look at. They're best dealt with as we move through Genesis in the course of the next video. So we won't necessarily go into all of them right here, especially if there's like specific Bible verses you have in mind. But what I'm going to take a look at is right, so first of all, terminology. I've been using the term pre-Adamism to generically cover 2 views, but pre-Adamism is actually distinct from what's called co-Adamism. Pre-Adamism is the idea that there were like people that like existed and then they were wiped out, and then Adam was created, and then Adam and Eve would be the original pair of all people today. So technically that's pre-Adamism. But then you've got co-Adamism, which is where Adam and Eve existed alongside other people. But sometimes it's just easier just to call them both pre-Adamism. Because either way you've got people that were already there when Adam and Eve were created. Okay, so anyway, that's a little terminology thing. Now, one of the criticisms against this is like, it tends to just feel completely read between the lines. Like, it's like, where are you getting this from? It's like it's being pulled out of thin air. And it's like the Bible doesn't say that there were other people. It doesn't come out and say that, so you're just kind of sort of creating that idea and then saying, well, it didn't say we can't, didn't say that, didn't teach against it, and it's not really, so therefore it's okay as well. That's not really a good way to read the Bible. You shouldn't just create things, ideas, and then say, if the Bible doesn't teach against it, then it's true. And I understand that. So that's the main reason I was saying this is a possibility and the Bible allows for it, but you could take it either way. Nonetheless, it would seem like you would still have to favor the original pair view, except that, like, when you get to Genesis 4 and you've got, Cain worried about people going to murder him, and then he's already got a wife, it's like a natural reading of that would be, hey, there were already people around. Adam and Eve were not the first 2 humans. Okay. But then that's all of a sudden, feels really weird, because it's like, why didn't the Bible mention the creation of humans? Why did it focus on the creation of Adam and Eve? Well, we talked about why that would be. And in essence, the other humans on the planet would really become human. In the pre-Adamite view, they would become humans. They would become what God really wanted them to be, so they wouldn't really be fully human until Adam and Eve, sort of brought them into a relationship with God. But anyway, here's my point. Genesis 4 does lend itself more towards a pre-Adamite view. And what I mean specifically is that's a pretty natural reading of this. That there are just other people that existed that God, for whatever reason, didn't mention the creation of. And it's like, well, the reason you would have a problem with that is you would say, like, well, it doesn't make sense for these humans not to be mentioned. So that's really the assumption that's driving this objection, is it's like, why wouldn't the creation of these humans be mentioned? Why isn't it mentioned? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. Like, one, Adam and Eve would have been far more important. Two, they might have been mentioned. If you go back to Genesis 1, I've got a sneeze. You ever had a sneeze building but it won't come out? It says, and God made the beasts, Genesis 1, the 6th day, it says, and God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So it's, and God made the che. And che is just like a generic word for like a living thing. So, it's translated, it's weird because it can be an adjective, a masculine noun, or a feminine noun. And it's translated beast 76 times. It's translated life 144 times. It's translated as living thing 6 times. It's translated as live as a verb 197 times. So most of the time it's a verb. So it's a pretty generico word. And so like it says let's see, in Genesis 1:28, when it says Adam and Eve were supposed to have dominion and subdue the earth, it says over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moves on the earth. That would be, it's just a generic term that just means like a living thing. Psalm 145:16 in the King James, thou openest thine hand and satisfiest the desire of every living thing. Like so anyway, that could, how do I put this? Could that include, humans who didn't have a moral consciousness? Yeah, just like animals. They would be lumped in with animals, but they would be more advanced than animals. So then that raises a follow-up question. It's like, well, okay, Adam and Eve are supposed to take dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves on the earth. But in the case of some of them, they're supposed to, like, teach them a moral consciousness, but not with the animals, not with the other animals. It's like, okay, well, all right. You could see it that way, but then Genesis 4 kind of lends itself to that reading, is the thing. Now, alternatively, you could read Genesis 4 as Cain was worried about Adam and Eve's other descendants murdering him, and that his wife was one of Adam and Eve's other descendants. Okay, so the point I want to make to you is that the original pair view is kind of on equal footing with the pre-Adamite view, because both views kind of have to, like, to make this text make sense, you have to create something in between the lines and sort of shove it in there, and they're kind of on equal ground. So I think you should be fairly familiar with the between the lines ideas of the pre-Adamite view. But what about the original pair view? Well, the original pair view has the problem of inbreeding, where you have to theorize that like God intended mankind to be inbred. And there was like massive inbreeding that was going on, and Adam and Eve were the first two humans, and so like, and then the same thing happened again with Noah, and it's like, okay, inbreeding is not seen as immoral. So let's clarify that. In the Jewish law of the Old Testament, God commands us to not do inbreeding. Okay, you can't marry your sister and your cousin and that kind of thing. Okay, but like when it comes to Abraham, he married his sister, I think his half sister, and then Isaac, marries his first cousin, I think, So like those laws were laws that God gave later, and there's no indication in Genesis that like it would have necessarily been, like God would have held them accountable for inbreeding because God hadn't commanded people not to do that. Okay. So then the problem becomes like, well, all right, that's fine, but there's a scientific problem with inbreeding, and it seems unlikely that people in the ancient world weren't aware that like you can't do too much of that, or else you will run into some birth defects. So like, as I understand it, you can do like one generation of like a father-daughter marriage or something like that, but their kids, you can't do it again. I don't know if that's true, but the issue is this is a biological medical problem, and so to get around that problem, you have to postulate a miracle that God performed. But that miracle, where do you get that miracle from? It's completely eisegetical. It's something that you are reading in the text. You're not getting it from the text. So that's my point. Like, to make an original pair view work, you have to make some sort of miraculous resolution of inbreeding that like, it's like, where do you get that from the text? And it's like, where is it that God performed a miracle, that like they could do this massive level of inbreeding, and then like, where does it come from? You see what I'm saying? It's completely just read in between the lines, and so that's why I'm saying that like whatever view you take, you're forced by Genesis to come up with something, kind of on your own, and then shove it in there to make it make sense. And the pre-Adamite view has a basis here in Genesis 4. So what about the original pair inbreeding view? Well, the original pair inbreeding view, I mean, like, the best you can do is you can go back to Genesis 1 where God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and you could say, okay, they had a special fruitfulness. It's a little bit of a stretch, like, to say that like God was performing a biological miracle with that. Like, that's just, again, calling that a miracle is reading in between the lines. So because there's a lot going on there. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's the point. Now, there's an additional point we need to make, is that this pre-Adamite view is not new. It's about 500 years old. Well, it's not old either. It's So where does it come from? It comes from the first European explorers who came to North and South America in the 1500s. The Spanish explorers discovered that there were already people here. And they said, how can there be people here? It took like our most advanced technology the world has ever seen for us to get here. How are there people here? And so they theorized that like these people aren't descendants of Adam like everybody else in the world. God created other people. That's where it comes from. And then in the 1800s, the pre-Adamite view was used as a way to justify biblical racism. There was a lot. The Bible was used quite a bit in the American South and in other places, and in England too, as Ephesians 6 saying, "Slaves, obey your masters." So, you had preachers who used the Bible to refute racism and slavery in the 1800s, and you had preachers who used it to support it, and the pre-Adamite view fell into that camp in the 1800s. So I just want to point that out, and that this is not the oldest view, but like it does seem to me that it's on an equal footing. Like, whatever problems you have with it, you can have the equal level of problems with the original pair view, and there is no like knockdown defeater for it. Like, so we'll talk about some of that stuff as we move on. But you would think like, oh, original sin, Romans 5, it's a knockdown defeater for pre-Adamite, and it's not really. So yeah, I think that covers it. So we'll sign off for now, and the next video will pick us up with the flood of Noah. All right, thanks for your time.